So obviously this panel is somewhat an early happy birthday to the United States, 250th, and the great experiment it has been, and the question of whether it will continue to be, or are we at the end of the experiment? So Mr. Carpenter, thank you for joining us. You have obviously worked as a U.S. diplomat and maybe even recently heard the Canadian Prime Minister talk about how the world order that everybody is missing was also somewhat of a fake story and not real, and that everybody needs to rethink everything. How do you feel about it all?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. I will maybe take a few minutes just to take issue with some of Prime Minister Carney's remarks, because I don't really agree with his entire suggestion that nation states over the course of the past 75 years have had to somehow toe the party line and be politically correct in terms of their adherence to what we call the rules-based international order, or at least what we used to. I think that's an overstatement by a long shot. I don't think you can compare world leaders in, say, the aughts or the 2010s to citizens in a repressive regime like Czechoslovakia, where Havel famously wrote his powerless essay. So I take a lot of issue with Carney's characterization. I think the rupture piece is perhaps more, it was the headline, I think it's more accurate. I do believe we have essentially a rupture in U.S. leadership in the international system. So let me perhaps just spend a little bit more time on that. The U.S. Over the course of the last 13 months has rapidly progressed down a road that we've seen a number of other countries in the world embark on over the course of the last, say, 15 years. And I'm thinking of countries like Hungary, or the Republic of Georgia, or Slovakia, or to a certain degree, Turkey. You could say Russia in the beginning of 2000s. It's a path in which the U.S. has started to take apart the checks and balances that make our democratic system what it is. The administration has gone after law firms, universities, independent media, a number of other civil society organizations, trying to intimidate them into holding their criticism of this administration and supporting it in terms of its policies. Now, we have a number of elected officials in the United States in very senior positions who deny the outcome of a democratic election in 2020. And we have a lot of trends that show that the U.S. is progressing down an illiberal or perhaps anti-liberal path. And so I think we see a very clear trend line here of the U.S. moving away from its democratic foundations. Now, I think it's too early to say whether the U.S. is firmly on the path towards dictatorship, or whether we have just merely embarked on it and whether the system will hold. But the point I want to make is that every time states in the international order have begun to move away from their democratic foundations, in other words, they were consolidated democracies to one degree or another and began to, and for whatever reasons, elected illiberal or anti-liberal leaders who then proceeded to take apart those democratic institutions. Those countries have engaged in rapprochement with other autocracies, or I should just say with autocracies, because they may not yet have reached that stage themselves. You see this very clearly with Hungary under the leadership of Viktor Orban. You see it now in the Republic of Georgia with a very clear effort by the Georgian Dream government to effectuate a rapprochement with both Russia and China. You see it to a lesser degree, but you do see it with Robert Fico's Slovakia, where again, Chinese investment is welcome. Mr. Fico is one of the few world leaders to travel to the recent SCO summit held in China. And again, rapprochement with Russia as well, even adopting some of President Putin's foreign policy planks. And so what you see with the United States these days is something very similar. We're embarking on a very similar trajectory. There has been a considerable rapprochement with Russia. The Trump administration has sought essentially to reset relations with Russia. It is constrained minimally by the legislative branch. And so President Trump is trying to end the war with Ukraine, I would suggest, primarily in order to be able to reap the fruits of the reset, which he wants to be able to implement, but he can't so long as there are sanctions in place on Russia. And then also when it comes to China, I think the picture is a little bit more nuanced. But there's also an attempt to seek a rapprochement in a trade deal. We know the leaders are scheduled to meet in April. And in advance of that, the Trump administration has really changed its tenor and its tone when it comes to trying to contain Chinese aggression. So, of course, President of Taiwan was discouraged from transiting the U.S. During overseas travel so as not to upset Beijing. We had the suspension of military assistance to Taiwan. We had a very tepid reaction. In fact, just the opposite. We had the United States counseling the Japanese Prime Minister to cool down her rhetoric when she was viciously attacked for suggesting that a Taiwan contingency would have regional repercussions for Japan. And so what we see across the board, whether it's the administration's embrace of El Salvador's leader Bukele, or whether we see this sort of, very non-realpolitik tariffs applied to swing states like South Africa, Brazil, India, which could be used to balance against Russia and China. Instead, we see a policy of rapprochement with authoritarian leaders and a distancing of the United States from its erstwhile democratic allies. So I don't need to tell you all in Berlin about the last couple of days of the Munich Security Conference or the last 13 months of this administration bashing allies like Canada, suggesting that the United States could acquire the territory of Greenland by force, which would be obviously a violation of the UN Charter and thereby estranging our relations with our longtime ally Denmark. And then, there was Vance's speech a year ago in Munich, where he took our European allies to task for supposedly, allegedly limiting free speech simply because they were moderating far-right neo-Nazi content on online platforms. And then the National Security Council's suggestion that we should be cultivating resistance to mainstream European parties. All of this is a piece. As I like to point out, the repression that we see internally in the U.S., which at this point is fairly isolated and limited in scope, which we clearly see in places like Minneapolis, that is really half of the same coin as U.S. threats against Greenland. Those two things are not a completely different abstract political phenomenon. They are very much conjoined. Again, over the course of decades, we've seen how countries that begin to engage in repression at home also tend to engage in aggression overseas. And I'm thinking principally of Russia and China, but you can also point to Iran, North Korea, and a number of other countries. So sadly, the U.S. is now embarked on this path. Where it ultimately leads, it's too early to say. We have a very strong civil society in the U.S. We have an opposition party. We have independent media. We have a number of other institutions that are still holding, but we have obviously progressed on a path that is departing from at least the last 100 years of U.S. history, as we have seen. So this has repercussions, as I say, both domestically in terms of the quality of our democracy and our institutions that are designed to uphold individual freedoms, But also, very importantly, it has repercussions for the international order and for how the United States sees its role in that international order, how it treats fellow democracies and how it treats autocracies.
Thank you. You spoke of civil society and one of the institutions that may push back against the changes that you were talking about. We have Danny here, who obviously led or was a very big part of the very first protests against the Trump administration in 2017. We didn't see that level of protest when he was inaugurated again in 2021. What does that say about the civil society that Mr. Carpenter is talking about?
Yeah, well, you know, in 2017, I think a lot of people saw the election of Donald Trump as a shock and also as an anomaly in the context of the United States and our political system, that it was something that needed an immediate response, but because it was not reflective of the nation that we had. We've heard it several times here at this conference that there is a very clear through line between Russia and interference in the 2016 election and Donald Trump's election that year. When he returned to power in 2024, there was a clear understanding that it was not a fluke. This was an era of American politics that we were now occupying. And the victory, the way that he was able to claim a mandate in that moment, really pushed back on the idea, especially among elite actors, you know, elected officials, institutions, businesses, that they could step out early and push back against the Trump agenda, even though it was obviously going to be an unpopular agenda just based on what they had put on paper again and again and again in the form of Project 2025. But the election was seen as a mandate for that agenda. And the reaction from our leadership, from Democrats in Congress, from corporate leaders, was to quickly try to find a way to respond to that apparent mandate, to fit into that mold of what America looked like as a result of the 2024 election. And, you know, despite the fact that we saw many of these actors begin to figure out how they could comfortably capitulate in this moment, the anger from the American voter, the base of our movements in the U.S., part of, Indivisible and other mobilization movements, did not sit still while these actors were capitulating. So, early on in 2025, we were getting questions very frequently from our movement. When are we taking to the streets? Why didn't we do it on Inauguration Day? When are we going to do it? And that demand, that hunger for a visible, mobilized opposition that was led by the people, is what led to the massive protests that we saw last year, both the hands-off protests in April and then the two No Kings protests, which were the largest single days of mass protest in American history. So the energy is there right now. The opposition to this administration is there. It took a while to find its own feet again after losing so significantly in 2024, but the incredible amount of rage that the average American has at what they are seeing on the streets of Minneapolis. I live in Washington, D.C., and back in August, the administration deployed the National Guard to fight crime or support law enforcement in Washington, D.C. That was supposed to be a 3-month deployment, and they are still there, walking the streets, armed soldiers patrolling the streets of Washington, D.C. for no reason. And what we cannot do is allow that to become normalized. And our job is to ensure that when people see that, when people see what's happening in Minnesota, they meet that with rage, with anger, with mobilization, and not with an understanding that this is just the way things are now.
Nick Davis, This Ordinary Thing, you want to tell us how you feel about where this is all going?
Yeah, as an American filmmaker in Berlin, it's hard not to feel the weight of history. And I mean, we haven't mentioned it yet, but there are obvious parallels that Americans of a certain kind are referring to all the time. And before we say, well, you're hysterical, that's not going to happen here, I think it's worth remembering that what has made America different, I think, is that we have, as he was suggesting, we do have a capacity for self-correction. And we've been, if not here before, we've been in lots of places like, this is about the 250th. At the 100th, at the centennial, we were 11 years removed from a civil war. So there have been moments where it felt like the American experiment was about to completely collapse. But my film is This Ordinary Thing is about non-Jews who helped Jews during the Holocaust. And what they did was they recognized the essential sameness of all human beings. And so they did what they thought was right and helped people who were different than them. And one of the things that somebody in the film says is that there is no such thing. Nations don't have consciences, right? There's no such thing as a collective soul. I have a soul, you have a soul, he has a soul, and only a democracy can only survive if those souls and consciences are activated. And I do think there was a kind of body blow to a lot of Americans when the election of 2024 took place, although there was also a quiescence, if that's the word, during the latter part of the Biden administration, when many people were thinking, wait a minute, this guy said he wasn't going to run again. Why is he running? We're playing right into their hands here. What's happening? And so as outraged and surprised as some of us are that January 6th wasn't the great gift to the American populace, okay, we're done with this. We see this guy, let's not do this again. All of a sudden, it's coming back and it's feeling inevitable. And so when Inauguration Day hits this time, and not only are the corporations not fighting back, they're standing arm in arm in the inauguration, behind him and cheering him on. And there was, I think, a sort of, oh gosh, here we go. It's 1936. No, I think it's more like 38. But I think now we're all finding our feet and realizing, we are American citizens. We are going to do whatever, give voice in whatever way we can to what we think is right and what we think this country should be. And so it's actually fairly heartening. I'm a lot less pessimistic than I was on the 20th of January, 2025. And I look forward to hearing from the judge, who can go all the way back to Paninks and tell us about how democracies start and where they end.
Former Congressman Jim Buckles, are we going to see a self-correction? Are Americans finding their footing? And isn't there a possibility that even if the opposition party wins, that they will never be the same in the way the Democratic Party operated before Donald Trump? Or should there be the same? Should they act exactly the same?
Well, of course, I am a member of the opposition party, and I could spend the rest of this week listing the failures of my party. Our inability to be assertive in offering something new and something real to the American people is one of the reasons that our country has fallen into the hands of those who would destroy it. And of course, if American democracy is destroyed, then the rest of democracy in the world is even more at risk. We can look at this as either a snapshot of the moment or a film. And looking at it from a purely political perspective at this moment, I would agree that things are looking up. This morning, Donald Trump is at 36% in the polls, the lowest he's ever been. We have a great deal of momentum in terms of reclaiming the House of Representatives in the fall. There is even some Republican apprehension about losing the Senate. I don't expect that to happen, but right now people are feeling like the breadth of the American people are last beginning to understand what they've done to themselves. There is that sentiment right now in this moment. This is especially so, I think, among independent voters. And it's the independent voters who make up about a third of the electorate, for those of you who are not Americans and don't follow these things daily, who elected Trump. They elected Trump in large part because of what they saw as the failures of the Biden administration, especially as relates to inflation. Well, now with our retreat into tariffs and protectionism, we're in a worse place in terms of the cost of living, a much worse place than we were before. But so much else was at stake, and the Democrats failed in being able to communicate to the American people that these demonic people were in fact the demons that they are politically. But that's a snapshot. Looking at it as a motion picture, as a film, as a movie, and a movie of the experiment in democracy would begin on the hillside called the Pnyx in Athens, where a democracy was invented in 508 BC. But it's continued and had its ups and downs now for 2,500 years and more. And one of the things we're failing to do is even talk about how we might change democracy so that we could keep its unfulfilled promise. What is the core promise of democracy? The core promise of democracy is individual self-rule. If you don't believe that people are capable of ruling themselves, then you're not a Democrat. And by that I mean a Democrat with a little d. I'm not talking here about political parties. If you think that educated people, wealthy people, people of a certain sort are much better at governing us than we, on the whole, as individuals, collectively, are capable of governing ourselves, then you don't believe in democracy. What we have at best in the world now, and only in a minority of the world's countries, are what, in my latest book, I call half democracies. They're pretend democracies in many respects. They exist on paper. You have elections. Sometimes the elections are real, sometimes they're not. Everything is controlled by money, 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 money. People may get to vote, but they have no real say in who they're voting for. Representatives are not truly representative in the sense that they should be. And ordinary people don't believe they're engaging truly in self-rule. This is a huge problem for democracy in that the major problem we have in democracies now, the pervasive problem we have in democracies, is that people feel they have no control over the direction of their own lives. And if democracy cannot be changed in ways that provide an opportunity for them to rule themselves and feel that they do have a say in controlling the direction of their own lives, then democracy will continue to be an experiment with an unfulfilled promise at best. Now, my remedy for this is participation. And in this latest book of mine, Democracy for a Sustainable World, I talk about the potential for having a universal participation through more self-rule, through the random selection of sortition that was used by the ancient Athenian citizens on that hillside called the Pnyx. Now, if you look back at ancient Athens, it was less than we would think a democracy should be. Half the people were not a part of it because they happened to be women. Immigrants were not citizens. They could not own property. Aristotle was an immigrant. He couldn't participate. He couldn't vote. He had to rent property. He couldn't own it. And then, of course, there were thousands upon thousands of slaves. So looking back, these were eyesores on the Athenian democracy, to be sure. But in my graduate work in history years ago, I was taught by a man named C. Van Woodward at Yale that it's important to look at historical moments and historical people, not so much to examine where they were, but in which direction they were going. And the Athenians who were citizens, that minority of them, invented the very idea that there could be self-rule. And they practiced it on a daily basis. And for those who were privileged to be citizens in that city-state at that time, they had the purest and truest form of democracy that's ever existed. That is where we should be going. But nowhere, for example, in my Democratic Party in the United States has anyone so much as mentioned how we might change democracy to make it more participatory. And furthermore, this is not something that should be advocated only by members of one particular party. Why does the MAGA movement exist? It exists for a lot of reasons, a lot of resentments, a lot of them reprehensible, racism, xenophobia, and the rest. But a lot of those reasons are because these people feel like they have lost control of their lives and that the elites have taken it from them and that they have no say in what's going to happen to them. Well, allow them to participate. And if we don't believe that they're capable of participating and making good decisions along with the rest of us, then we're not Democrats. We may be technocrats or something else. We're not Democrats. But what's missing most in our discourse, I think, is any concept of trying to change and improve democracy to make it what democracy should be. We're so much on the defensive against the authoritarians, against the fascists, against those who would bring us back to the 1930s and worse. And I understand that. But the only true way to win that combat, the only true way to meet that challenge is by offering something better. And I would say that structurally, we need a better form of governance that enables people to participate and genuinely rule themselves. And if and only if we have that, can we move toward the global sustainable development that will give us the social, economic, and environmental advances that will enable us to live on a planet that can survive and have a prosperity that can be shared by all. And no one in my party, in my country, is even talking about that. And these are the good guys.
Ish.
Mr. Carpenter, you hear that, what goes through your mind? If this is the opposition party, how does the United States self-correct?
So I listened with a lot of interest to what was just said, and I have to say I agree with almost all of it. What I think is troubling, however, about the future is that even as we seek to reinvigorate the participatory roots of our democracy, I think we're ahead for some very troubling times. The way I interpret the rise of MAGA in the United States, and I don't see it in isolation as a uniquely American phenomenon, because I think you do have a lot of movements around the world that are very similar, maybe not identical, but that articulate similar grievances to those that are being articulated by the MAGA movement. And I think if you sort of look at this, maybe from the vantage of political sociology or political theory, it has to do, really stepping back and looking at this from a sort of 60,000 foot vantage. I think a lot of this has to do with, at least in my interpretation, what the sociologist Sigmund Bauman has called liquid modernity. This notion that identities are constantly changing, that reality is changing, that what we previously saw as fixed is actually liquid or liminal or somehow changing in front of our very eyes. So some of the assumptions that my generation made, Gen X, or my parents' generation made about, how they would structure their life project, those sorts of assumptions can no longer be made by the younger generations, Gen Alpha or Gen Z or even millennials. And so I think the fact that there is so much uncertainty in the conduct of daily life in terms of finding a job, getting an education, trying to buy a house, start a family, all of that has become so uncertain due to changing economics, changing geopolitics, that I think we're going to be in for a bumpy ride. And I think if AI materializes the way that a lot of the prophets of AI are prophesying, people like smarter than me, like Yuval Harari and others, then it's going to bring even more sort of consternation and uncertainty into the lives of citizens, not just in the U.S., but really around the world. And so that means that the search for sort of for easy answers to very challenging emotional and psychological and social situations is going to mean that populism is going to be with us for a period of time to come. And populism will orphan it. It may no longer resemble the MAGA movement of today, but the populists of tomorrow, I think, are going to be able to feed off this angst that exists sort of in the air, which is a sort of a structural condition of this particular period of history that we're in. And so I think it's going to be a challenge. I think, finding a stable foundation for liberal democracy is going to be a challenge, not just in the United States, but you see it, right now in the major European powers, in the UK, in France, and Germany, where you have anti-establishment parties that are nipping at the heels of the leaders in all of those countries. You see it in Poland. You see it in many countries around in Latin America too, in East Asia. And so I think for those of us who care deeply about democracy and liberal governance, we really have to re-examine, how institutions survive in an age where people are very concerned about how they can structure their life project in a way that is completely different from what their parents did, and where answers that they're trying to find are not at their fingertips. And so it's just going to take a lot of creativity about designing a system, bringing people into that system, so that we don't sort of fall off a cliff the way that Russia, did at the end of the 1990s, because otherwise the world living in is going to be a much more dangerous.
Following up on that, what do you think, Danny, that the civil society needs to do to obviously play a role in the coming months? Obviously, the election in November, but beyond that, to have an answer that makes, MAGA less appealing, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and there's not one answer. The protests that I referenced are an important part of building a visible, mobilized opposition that people can see, they can feel it, they can tell that they're not alone in this moment in their opposition. But we need to go beyond just going out in the street and protesting. That is important, protected First Amendment activity. But what we are actually looking at now is what it would look like to mobilize those 7 million people towards non-cooperation. So going beyond a protest moment and doing things very similar to what Renee Good and Alex Preddy were doing, monitoring the activities of ICE and federal law enforcement, to be the eyes on the ground and show the world what is happening, to make sure that they are not able to operate in secret, despite the fact that ICE is running around wearing masks and refusing to reveal their identities. That, after the killing of both Renee Good and Alex Preddy, it would be very reasonable for American citizens to react in fear, and for the ability of ICE to actually do this kind of violence to our own people to expand significantly, because they have demonstrated the willingness to commit violence, to commit murder on the streets. That is not what we saw. Immediately after the killing of Alex Preddy, we hosted a ICE Watch training, and 200,000 people joined that to learn how to do exactly the same kind of work that Renee Good and Alex Preddy were killed doing. It is a really incredible sign that there is enough energy in the ecosystem to actually harness it. But what we need is strategic leadership to mobilize it in the right directions. And one of the biggest hurdles that we are going to face if we do end up in a space where, the election is under threat or they're trying to deny results, we need to be able to get workers to engage in economic non-cooperation, disruptive economic non-cooperation, in order to actually shake loose some of the increasingly entrenched fascist leadership and politics that we're seeing right now. That is a high bar to clear, though, especially for Americans. We are not a people who are prone to striking. This is not our vibe. We're just getting there with protest activity. So it's going to take a lot of work, but we need to be looking at the full breadth of what disruptive non-cooperation will look like for people in the opposition movement. Because, like the judge said, when folks feel like they don't have power, voting is not an answer that is compelling to them. It is still essential. They must vote. We need people to vote. We need people to believe that it still matters. But telling them that there's an election in November when people are getting shot on the streets today is not going to mobilize the kind of opposition and inputs that we need in order to win.
Jim, if you want to add something.
If I may just add a word to what Danny's just said, and I think you'll agree with this. The need for taking the idea of protest to some next level is, I think, a good and necessary one. And there are varying forms in which this might happen, including work stoppages. But it's going to be essential that the opposition not become, in that process, like those we oppose. The opposition must be nonviolent in every respect. If we look back to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, what broke the back of the opposition to the civil rights movement was what happened at Selma, when the civil rights protesters did not fight back. And television showed Bull Connor and his minions beating defenseless people. Now, at some level, as an American, you may not vote right all the time, but you don't think people who are defenseless should be beaten in the streets. And of course, that's why we've had the reaction to what happened in Minneapolis, because the vast, vast majority of the American people still feel that way. And it's their fault that they've allowed this to get this far, because knowing who and what he was, they brought Donald Trump back into power. And he even got the most votes in 2024. So we have no excuse as a country. But in opposing these unconstitutional and abhorrent actions, we must not become like those we oppose. We must continue to stand on the moral high ground. The greatest American for the last century was Martin Luther King Jr., and there was a reason for that.
I wonder, given that your film is about people who did extraordinary things in extraordinary times, Danny was just mentioning that Americans rose to the occasion, some, given the circumstances they're in. But at least I personally, sometimes coming from Iran, where we were used to authoritarian systems and built up, kind of resistance and potential risk-taking that was not very common in Western world, my initial reaction, to the election was, oh, no way Americans are ready for this. And they just have no idea what is about to happen, let alone how to fight it back. But your film obviously talks about people who take steps that they also weren't ready to take.
That's right. Nobody knows how you're gonna react until somebody knocks on your door and says, "Hey, can you help me?" And I think as a nation, I think the real question that Danny and the judge are getting at, what I'm curious about, is to what extent do we still trust our institutions? And with an election coming up, if we don't trust those election results, or we're predisposed to say, well, we're not going to believe it, it's like Citizen Kane, fraud at the polls, or, Kane elected. And if a group of people are just ready to say, oh, we don't trust these election results, and also there is an apparatus in place, or might be, or might seem to be, where, in fact, those who talk about rigging elections often rig the elections themselves. So, what are the groups that you work with, Danny? What are they doing to ensure that, in fact, we do have fair and safe elections this November? Granted, it's a bunch of months away, and there's a lot of other things to worry about on the way to that. But whatever optimism we may feel about, the reactions to the horrors and the tragedies in Minneapolis, there is still a sense that these guys will do anything to stay in power. And how do we respond to that? On a wider level than just somebody knocks on the door and needs help and we'll help them. And there isn't that much of a sense that we trust our institutions, we trust our opposition party, we trust any of the sort of things, the safeguards that we used to feel we had in place. We don't necessarily trust them anymore. And so, although my last answer, I tried to be optimistic, I'm now realizing, I don't know what's going to happen in November. Whatever the polls may say, we still are going to have elections, and a whole group of people may not agree with the elections.
What if ICE shows up at a polling station, stops the count? It's not in a state that a Democratic, leader is running. So the state police will not be intervening. So let's say it's a district in Florida that would normally go Democratic, but then ICE shows up and stops the count and says something is wrong here. The Florida governor is not going to confront that. Then that particular district will be.
Well, that's what precisely happened without the assistance of ICE in 2000 in Florida. The public record will reflect that I have a bit of a bias here. I was vice chair for Al Gore's Florida campaign, but that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
The fact that the state election process was controlled by the other party ended up halting a recount, and the fact that there were 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats on the Supreme Court of the United States ended up deciding the election. I got along quite well with the second President Bush. I was a great admirer of his father, and I like George W., but in my view, he was not elected. He was selected in 2000. 4 years later, he was legitimately elected president in 2004. But the first black mark in a long time on our electoral process was the denial of the presidency to Al Gore. And the proof of Al Gore's patriotism is that he told his supporters to stand down. I'm not sure what would happen in such an instance today.
Well, I don't think Al Gore's supporters would necessarily have risen up, in part because.
Well, the fact is we did not.
Yeah,
and I doubt we would have even otherwise.
But also, I think that, and as a storyteller, as the word is, as a filmmaker, I feel like the story in 2000 was Bush wins Florida. Oh no, wait a minute, and so there was a huge shift that was trying to be made to overturn what we had been told on election night. And that was disastrous.
The media, such as it is, got it wrong, and that
it was maddening.
Led to the long train of things. Yeah. Just a personal anecdote, and I'm running for re-election in 1992. I was the first Democrat in the history of the South elected and then re-elected in a majority Republican district. So my winning was not a foregone conclusion. The polls closed at 7 p.m. At 9 p.m., Associated Press in the state capitol declared that I had lost. They put the numbers up on the screen. It showed 81% of the votes were in, and I had lost in a landslide. The problem was that they had transposed the number. 18% of the votes were in, not 81%. We knew exactly where those votes were. We had expected to lose those votes. 4 hours later, I was declared the winner. But despite that, my opponent believed that somehow
Funny business.
it was rigged in my favor. So he demanded a recount, which was not required by law, but I agreed to one and ended up winning by even more votes. It was still a close election, but I won. And my reward for that was that a decade later, during Bush v. Gore, I was held out as the example to the Bush campaign of a candidate who was willing to agree to a recount, even though they had prevailed in the first count. That was my reward. And at the time, of course, I'm in Geneva and I'm a judge. In any event, people get a certain expectation, and then everything else flows from that.
Mr. Carpenter, if you have something to add to that, and then we'll go to questions. Otherwise, we'll go to questions now.
I'm just add one more thing. Namely, my family was heavily involved in the solidarity movement in Poland in the 1980s. And although very different situation historically and practically, one of the key aspects of building a social movement in opposition to a very much more repressive regime in communist Poland was creating this sense of shared identity and shared values. And that's something that's really incumbent on not just the Democratic Party, but those in the United States who care about preserving democracy, is creating this sense of shared identity. And you see a little bit of that starting to happen now. Maybe it's in opposition to some of the excesses of ICE in Minneapolis, the killing of Ms. Good, Mr. Preddy, and similar incidents in other places. But in my view, just from where I sit, and I really am not a foreign policy guy, I don't do domestic politics, but from where I sit, it's not enough. We haven't reached this sort of critical mass where there is this widespread sense. It doesn't have to be all-encompassing within the population. It just there has to be a critical mass that identifies with an opposition movement to restore democracy or to create democracy, which was the case in Poland because it hadn't existed beforehand. But I feel like the leadership is not yet there, and some of the tools that go into creating social movements, and there's a whole literature on this, have not been fully exploited. So I'll just leave it at that, and then happy to go to the Q&A.
Great. If anybody has any questions, we're ready for them. Go ahead.
I live in New York, and I do have friends from the both parties. I can see the growing discontent between both parties, and that seems to be growing. And one of my the concern, and I don't know how big is concern, and we all heard that social media has been used as a tool to continue to drive that wedge to create a bigger division. And there are a lot of fanatic organizations that are very good on using social media. And then we have potentially bad actors that around the world that try to create a division within the United States, or even us around the world. How much of these concerns should we be? And are we going to have a way to deal with this growing complex problem?
Yeah, social media.
I mean, the horror is that so many of our institutions and politicians and corporations and organizations are dividing us, and they're set up to do that. And the algorithms are only speaking to you or only speaking to you, and we're all in our own silos. I'm not saying anything that we don't all know, but what's particularly dispiriting about it is that this idea that wait a minute, we're all on this planet for a very short period of time. And it's all of this is just an accident of birth, that you were born on that team and you were born on that team. And you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a know-nothing, you're a copperhead. I mean, it's so silly. And I think so long as we are really driven by the capitalist impulse, and I am a capitalist. I want to make that clear, and not a very good one, but I do what I can. I don't know how you break that. I don't know if there is money to be made in dividing us. I don't know how you unite us or point out what unites us is so much bigger than what separates us. And I don't know the answer to that.
I'm going to do something that I would never have done in a town meeting in my conservative congressional district back in Florida. I'm going to quote Marx and Engels. This follows on your very astute observation about liquid modernity, or maybe that was our friend on
That was
which I found true. And as he knows, and many of you know of capitalism, Marx and Engels said everything solid melts into air. One of the downsides and upsides of capitalism is it undermines a lot of assumed certainties. This can lead to more open societies, to the unleashing of human imagination and creation, or it can lead to despair. But capitalism is not about sustaining culture. Capitalism is forever changing culture. That's what capitalism does. That's what imagination does. So it's hard to hold on to anything. That's part of what I was saying earlier. And Tom's right online. This is a global issue. We've spoken of MAGA because this session is about the United States, but this is happening all over the world. It's what gives rise to populist reactions everywhere. And the danger of populism is not that the people are speaking up or that they want to take action or they want to make things happen. The danger of populism is when it's wed to illiberalism and to ignorance and superstition and xenophobia and racism. In our own history, the Populist Party in the 1890s had a lot of good ideas. Many of them became part of the progressive American movement of the early 20th century. But many of them also yielded to racism and xenophobia. And those were not good ideas. They still are not.
Yeah, populism has become almost a bad word in America, but people, I mean, it shouldn't be.
Well, Lincoln was right. We need to appeal to the better instincts of the people.
But how do we do that in such a way so that money flows that way?
Well, one of the things we were asked is what amendments we would make to the Constitution. In 1978, the Supreme Court of the United States made in a case called Buckley v. Valeo a decision about the First Amendment that I think was absolutely wrong. But I'm not on the Supreme Court. The decision was this: the First Amendment to our Constitution provides for freedom of speech. The court decided that the spending of money on elections is an expression of freedom of speech. I think that's absolute nonsense, but it is on the basis of that decision that other decisions, such as Citizens United, have flowed, so that we now have unlimited money, much of it undisclosed. My friend Chuck Schumer, with whom I served in the House, has proposed a constitutional amendment that would reverse Buckley v. Valeo. That's one thing we should do. And then we should somehow control the flow of money in politics. Because as I said earlier, eloquently, it's all about money, 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 money. And that's behind so much of it. in both parties, I might say.
Just to respond on the social media point, two of the most important components of a functioning democracy are the ability to trust and an opportunity to actually engage accountability for powerful people. And when we're talking about the social media ecosystem that we live in right now, this is not a force of nature that just came about and all of us have no ability to do anything. There are people who are directly responsible for the structure of these algorithms, the structure of these corporations, and what is shared on these platforms, and how they are driving us against each other, how they are sharing misinformation and outright lies on a regular basis and degrading both the ability to trust one another and skirting accountability for what they have done to our society. Now, we had a great conversation yesterday about, censorship and freedom of speech in the context of social media and, cancel culture and everything. That is, I think, separate from the fact that these, the heads of these corporations, Elon Musk, all of these social media figureheads, they have really restructured the way American democracy works, and they are totally isolated from any accountability from the American electorate for that. We didn't choose to live in this different version of our democracy, a degraded version of our democracy, where so much of what is shared and driven politically is shared through, talking heads who are, absolutely not qualified in any way to speak on, any of the content that they do. But they have followings and they have platforms because these algorithms have made them famous. And it is a situation that it is global. It is absolutely global. But we have to understand that there are people who are responsible for this. It is not just the state of the world.
Mr. Carpenter, do you have worries that this is out of control and when it comes to social media?
I do, and I'll just add one element to this discussion, which is I think that social media has dramatically undermined a sense of civic identity in the United States. It's not social media alone. You have politicians, as I said, who are reacting to the uncertainty of these times to try to reach back to some fundamental, constant identity that is grounded either in race or ethnicity. Just in the last few weeks, I've heard so many administration appointees talking about Scots-Irish identity. I think that's a placeholder for white nationalism. But in any case, we're losing this sense of civic identity. And Vice President of the United States has said that you can't build America based on an idea of belief in the Constitution. Well, I'm sorry, that was an idea that held for a very long time and that did unite people around a common identity. But when you don't have that, it's very difficult to create the institutions of a democracy on something where there are fundamental divisions based on race or ethnicity, something else. And social media very much contributes to that.
Go ahead.
I think this is a very interesting point, but I am a bit confused because when I know that the big media corporations are owned by very few corporations, as everybody knows. So if you have social media, by definition, this is more democratic with a small d, which means there are more emitters of information. However, I in a way agree too, because you have a bias, because there is an algorithm which makes that Google isn't neutral, which makes that YouTube isn't neutral, which makes that X isn't neutral. They all are very partisan. There are some ideas that both platforms, all of these platforms do block, and some ideas that all of these platforms promote. And then there are some ideas which are, of course, in opposition. So you have black and white, and then there's a battle between ideas. So the question is, if we really want democracy, can we do something for neutrality of these big platforms? And isn't social media the key to the freedom of opinion and to the freedom of speech?
Well, this is I don't think you're confused at all. I think you're absolutely correct. And I believe there's a great need for regulation of these companies that we have not had. And it must be said, both the Democratic and the Republican parties have allowed this to happen. My own party's been in bed with a lot of these people along the way, and they have no real political allegiance, so they fund everyone who's willing to allow them to do as they wish. This has to change, but it can't change until we have different people in positions of responsibility.
Well, I think it also goes to trust. I think regulation would be great, but whom do we trust to do the regulating?
And there's a very real question about. I mean, this is a topic for a day-long seminar. There's a very real question, as I'm sure you would agree, about the wisdom of regulating content, and who does that? Who do we trust to do that?
But there are laws. So there is some content.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
There are laws. So there's
LOST?
some content
LAWS.
for some reason, So what I am always surprised that there is seemingly a need for regulation of content which is legal. So this is what I never understand. There are laws in every country, in the United States and Germany. You're not allowed to offend people. You're not allowed to have pornography. You're not allowed to. But there are limits to what you can say.
Well, I'm generally with John Stuart Mill on this.
Sorry?
I'm generally with John Stuart Mill on these issues in terms of freedom of speech. So I would allow more of it.
Yes.
There was a question there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question perhaps for the judge, but curious what others think about it too. I resonate a lot with your comments on how do you make democracy more participatory. Really, in practical terms, what do you see as some of the best ways for us to make democracy more participatory?
Well, I've read the whole book on this, and I'll give you a flyer about it rather than reciting it. But
Is this the one?
Yes, it's called Democracy for a Sustainable World: The Path from the Pnyx. And I'll be talking about it in London later this week to people with whom I've been working on the notion of creating global citizens' assemblies. We've just succeeded at the most recent climate COP in institutionalizing what we started 4 years ago in Glasgow, which is a global citizens' assembly based on random selection of ordinary people worldwide who come together and grapple with the issues facing the climate conference. And the climate conference itself is just institutionalized so that it will be expanded and will happen in every succeeding conference going forward. Now, our goal is to make this a decision-making body along with the rest of the climate conference. And our further goal is to do this with every international institution, including, I must say, since I'm a former chief judge for the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And in Geneva, I made this point in the most recent global public forum there a couple of months ago, and surprisingly, no one walked out. They applauded. There is nascent support for this. Young people all over the world who've been involved, especially in the climate movement, are now moving to ask, as Danny asked, how do we go from the streets into the decision-making rooms? And that's what we're trying to do. And in my view, idealistic perhaps, but why change now? My view is that we should do that in every form of democratic decision-making all over the world. And where, as in most places, democracy doesn't exist even in a half democratic form, we must find ways, of course, to create it, even if it means standing up and fighting for it.
Danny?
Yeah, so just to add on to that, there are some technical ways that we can go about creating more participatory democracy. Public financing of elections would lower the threshold that it actually takes to get into, races and campaigns and run them for young people who are looking to get involved.
And there are digital components to this.
Yes.
So public social media can be part of it.
Yeah. But one of the things that is very relevant for my organization is that and part of the work of a participatory democracy is being able to participate in the process of accountability. And, in 2017, when we did see those large, immediate backlash protests to the election of Donald Trump, a lot of those were centered around congressional town halls that Republicans were holding. And our work was really focused on driving people to those town halls so they could make sure that they were applying pressure to their members of Congress directly and visibly. When we, came around to 2024, the number of members of Congress who are holding town halls is minimal. They don't post them publicly anymore. They oftentimes will hold them on Zoom and pre-screen all the questions. They do not have open town halls for their constituents in the same way that they did even 5 years ago. And that is a huge shift. And I genuinely believe it would be a benefit for our democracy if members of Congress were mandated to hold town halls on a regular basis with their constituents, open to questions and open to the public.
Any more questions?
I have one thing to
Please.
actually ask, which is, would a national holiday work for Election Day? Why haven't we done that?
Well, anything that would increase turnout would help, and I think a national holiday for Election Day would do so. Basically, we have one side that's trying to get as many people to vote as possible, and another side that's trying to shrink the electorate in a certain way. Right. So that's the competition. The people who would favor a national holiday are those who would want more people to vote. There's a lot of people who have to work, they can't get off to go vote.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for participating in this. Michael Carpenter for joining us and sticking with us. Danny, Judge, Nick Davis. And of course, there's another 20 minutes or so for people to mingle and talk in the room if you like to. But it's very, very nice to have you all here and hear
Pleasure.
your ideas. Thank you very much.